Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this conference. My name's Julia Thrift, and I work for the TCPA, the Town and Country Planning Association, and we're hosting this event today in partnership with Natural England. The conference is called Achieving a Healthy Green Recovery, the Essential Role of Green Infrastructure, and it'll take place as 3 webinars, and this is the first one. Green infrastructure, trees, parks and green spaces have never been in the news as much as they have been in the last year. Few people now question the many benefits they bring to our health, our happiness and our economy. Yet until recently, whether or not a neighbourhood has a green space and whether it's any good has been down to a mixture of historical accident and pot luck. There's never been a nationwide systematic approach to ensuring that all communities have the green infrastructure that they need, of a good quality and planned, designed and maintained to ensure it lasts into the future. This is starting to change both in terms of policy and practice, and these exciting initiatives are what we're going to hear about today. We'll be live tweeting from this event, and we really hope that you'll join us using the hashtags GreenInf21 and Green Recovery. Next slide, please. This conference has been jointly organised by Natural England and the TCPA on behalf of the Green Infrastructure Partnership. The Green Infrastructure Partnership is a national network of people and organisations working to achieve high-quality green infrastructure. It's free to join, which is made possible by the generous support of a number of sponsors, and we'd like to thank them very much for their support. And we hope that if you aren't already a member of the partnership, you'll consider joining and receive a free newsletter 10 times a year, updating you about green infrastructure policy, practice and funding across the whole of the UK. Natural England, the TCPA and the Green Infrastructure Partnership sponsors have provided lots of free materials for you to look at and download in the Expo booth. The Expo booth can be accessed by clicking on the tab on the left-hand side of your screen. The conference is being recorded and will be available on the TCPA's website within the next few days, and delegates will be sent a link to the web page. So on with the first session. The topic of this session is the role of green infrastructure in a healthy green recovery. We've a lot to get through with some really interesting speakers. We won't take questions after each presentation, but there'll be plenty of time at the end. But please don't save your questions until the end. Post them in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen as you think of them. So now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Rebecca Powell MP, Minister for the Environment at Defra. Rebecca is the Member of Parliament for Taunton Deane and Parliamentary Under Secretary of State at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. In 2018, she was awarded a Green Heart Hero Award by the Climate Coalition, a coalition of over 100 charities and community groups across the UK for being the greenest new MP. She was instrumental in gaining extra protection for ancient woodland and veteran trees, and bringing forward the ban on microbeads and for getting soil health on the agenda. So now over to Rebecca Powell.
Thank you for the opportunity to introduce this event, which features a wonderful agenda that champions the importance of green infrastructure. Now, last year, the Prime Minister made a commitment to build back better and greener from the pandemic. Putting the environment at the centre of our economic revival is essential and can help create and support up to 250,000 jobs. One of the most effective ways of achieving this in the built environment is through green and blue infrastructure. When well designed, it can contribute to biodiversity recovery. It can help us mitigate and adapt to the climate emergency and alleviate flooding. The pandemic has demonstrated the benefits of having truly local green space for our health and well-being. Many of us have personally felt the benefits of spending time in nature, and emerging science is increasingly confirming this. Our 25-year environment plan set out our ambition to connect more people with the natural environment, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds. And the government's green social prescribing projects are improving mental health and well-being in communities hardest hit by coronavirus. We recently announced that Natural England will be taking forward the government's commitment to design additional protected landscapes. Natural England will consider the designation of the Yorkshire Wolds and the Cheshire Sandstone Ridge areas of outstanding natural beauty, as well as extensions to 2 other areas. With reforms to the planning system, we have the opportunity to be truly ambitious about what is possible for our places. Across the country, we're seeing inspiring new plans that put green and blue infrastructure at the heart of development and regeneration. Stockton Council, which is receiving support through government's Future High Streets Fund, has bold plans to demolish a failing shopping arcade in Stockton-on-Tees and replace it with a new Riverside Park. And the Association of Essex Local Authorities has announced its vision for South Essex to become a regional parkland setting, all connected as part of the same ecological community. These places are leading the way in demonstrating how the natural and built environment can be interconnected to benefit people and nature. I recognise that the funding model for green infrastructure is different to other types of growth-enabling infrastructure, and we need to marshal a range of contributions. This includes public sector investment, like the Nature for Climate Fund, biodiversity credits from developers, and carbon offsetting. And in addition to getting the ambition and the funding right, we need to address a lack of understanding of what good green infrastructure looks like and how best to unlock its multiple benefits. The Green Infrastructure Standards Framework that we are developing with Natural England and intend to launch in 2022 will do this. The framework includes a menu of green infrastructure standards that can be applied at different scales, and the first national green and blue infrastructure maps for England. A design guide will support the design of blue and green infrastructure, from green walls, swift bricks, bee bricks, through to forest ponds and wetlands. Now, one way new developments can deliver green infrastructure is through meeting our new mandatory Biodiversity Net Gain in the Environment Bill. By requiring at least a 10% uplift in biodiversity, we are ensuring that all new developments enhance the environment. And we welcome ambitious developers and local authorities who choose to go even further. There will be an emphasis on on-site delivery as a preference to secure benefits for local communities. However, we do recognise that not all developments will be able to achieve the 10% biodiversity net gain on site. And a recent market analysis completed for biodiversity net gain estimated that the policy would create a market for off-site habitat creation or enhancement worth up to £160 million a year. Now, this is important. And although we know that globally, nature-based solutions can provide up to a third of the most cost-effective mitigation we need, currently they receive just 3% of total global climate finance. And we need to drive up investment in nature for its own sake, for our efforts to tackle climate change and for people who so rely on it. I want to touch now on local nature recovery strategies. Now, these are a new system of spatial strategies for nature, which will drive more coordinated, practical and focused action to help nature. They will help deliver the wider benefits of nature, whether this is climate change mitigation through tree planting and peat restoration, reducing nutrients or preventing flooding. And obviously, helping nature recover can create attractive green spaces for people too. So to conclude, the benefits of well-designed green infrastructure are vast. The Green Infrastructure Standards Framework, a focus of this afternoon's session, will help us to achieve these benefits. And we need to continue to work with local authorities, communities, and the development industry. And events such as this are really important to showcase what can be achieved and demonstrate the commitment that is already there. And following this path together, we can achieve a healthy green recovery, fulfilling the goal to build back better and greener.
So that was an incredibly detailed introduction from Minister Powell. As you can tell, there's an enormous amount going on in policy terms at a national level, and some of that detail will be unpacked later on. So do stay with us for the whole day, because then you'll be able to hear more about things such as the Green Infrastructure Standards Framework and put questions to our speakers to learn more about it. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to our next speaker, who is Marion Spain. Marion is Chief Executive of Natural England and has been since May last year, and previously was Interim Chief Executive. Prior to that, she was Chief Executive of Plant Life International, and during her career, she's held a wide range of roles in environmental organisations. So welcome, Marion, and over to you.
Thank you, Julia. I have some slides, so bear with me, and bear with me if I also have to just glance down at my notes occasionally. I still haven't got quite used to doing online presentations without props, but it's really great to be here and to have so many of you joining us. There is a danger. I may say everything that Minister Powell just said so well, but I have pictures, so bear with me if we cover some of the same themes. I always think on days like today, where you've got a number of organisations working together, there will be a little bit of overlap and repetition, but hopefully different perspectives as well. So the conference today, and we're very grateful for TCPA for partnering with Natural England on the conference, hopefully will give you the opportunity to learn more about green infrastructure, what it is and why it matters, to spend some time thinking how we can make the use of the new policy and delivery initiatives coming along to help with green infrastructure. And also, as has already been said, we will also be talking about the tools that Natural England are developing to help the green infrastructure standards and some of the mapping tools. So if I could have the next slide, please. Perhaps the obvious question to start with is, what is green infrastructure? So there's a sort of an official definition on that slide, which I won't read out, but I'll just draw attention to three key words. Green and blue, this is water, as well as green spaces. Urban and rural, I think, is important to keep in mind, because sometimes in green infrastructure conversations, we tend to think urban, but people in rural areas need access to green space just as much. And I think the other word I wanted to pull out of there is that communities and prosperity word. Green infrastructure is not just about nature, it's about our health, our well-being, and our social and economic well-being as well. The other phrase that one of my team used that I've rather stolen is it's nature multitasking. It's nature giving us lots of benefits. And the one picture on there that actually is the dullest, because it's a long view, that top left picture is a piece of green infrastructure near to my home. And the reason I wanted to put it on the slide, that is green and common. And those of a certain generation, if you say green and common, will think American nuclear base, Box Natural Wildlife Trust, into one of the most popular green spaces right between Newbury and Thatcham, good sized market towns in Berkshire, and it is busy every day. And that inspires me. If we can make green infrastructure on a former nuclear base, we can make it anywhere. So next slide, please. Similar theme in terms of that, what we're all about. Again, a vision there. And again, I won't read all of the words out because you can look at those yourself. But I think, again, it reinforces that multitasking point, that green infrastructure certainly helps nature recover, certainly puts wildlife and landscape and beauty back. It definitely helps with our health, with the green recovery and the health recovery from COVID. It certainly will tackle climate change, and I'll say more about that later. And it is certainly there to add growth and prosperity. So next slide, please. So again, just a little bit more on what the evidence tells us about what green infrastructure tells us. So the document referenced there and shown there was a piece of work we did with the University of Exeter that gave us conclusive evidence that those that live in greener living environments are more likely to have better health and well-being. So reinforcing that point that this is good for us. But also two other important points came out of that research. One is that a mixed provision of green space is important. We need a mix of both publicly accessible green space, such as green routes and neighbourhoods, but also that private green space, including gardens, is important as well. And the other important learning, I think, is good quality green space is important. It's no good just to have a bit of dull mown grass or semi-dead trees. It's good quality that really brings the benefits. The final important point I wanted to pull out on this slide is that term social interventions, which I sometimes think of as just because we build it, they won't come. So provision, physical provision of green space is important, but just as important is finding ways, such as through social prescribing link workers, that enables communities, enables individuals that might not feel confident, comfortable, even interested in visiting green space to get those benefits. So we need high quality green space, and we need to find many different ways of helping people engage. So next slide, please. And a few facts and figures coming up now to tell us a bit more of the evidence about why it matters what we know. I think we would all know during the pandemic, our own lived experiences told us that nature was important to us. But the numbers on this slide, the facts and figures on this slide, reinforce the survey work that Natural England did during COVID. How many people, 82% of adults believe that nature makes them happy, and 43% said that visiting green space is even more important to their well-being than it was before the pandemic. Next slide, please. Again, some figures to reinforce a trend we've seen over the last 10 years that COVID has certainly reinforced even further, that people are far more likely now to visit green space closer to home. So more people are spending time in green space, but visiting nature close to home, which of course for many of us, but not all of us, means towns and cities, is just as important. 2 out of 3 people now are making nature visits within 2 miles of home. Next slide, please. So here's some facts and figures about children. Note on there, lots more children spending time in green space, but the vast majority of them are spending that time in urban green spaces. But the other fact, the worrying facts we've learned during COVID and during our survey work is that not all children are accessing green space, and some of them are not accessing it at all. The children in our 10 most deprived communities are least likely to access a natural environment. And given that we know that children that live in a green environment, in the greenest areas, have more favourable cognitive development, the fact that there are children out there who have absolutely no opportunity to visit green spaces is something of a tragedy, I think. And that theme also applies for adults as well. So next slide, forgive me, these slides are slightly complex, so I will just pull out the key facts for you. This slide shows us that you can see on there, the bluer the areas, so those Devon, Hampshire, Isle of Wight and so on, those blue areas are where our most affluent adults are most visiting the countryside. So the lucky people in those areas not only have high quality green space, they are also affluent enough to be able to visit. The next slide, please, shows the other side of the story. That shows us the number of the proportion of adults in the least affluent socioeconomic groups who make the least visits. So those red areas are the ones to draw your attention to. And to note that while they are the major conurbations, London, West Midlands, Greater Manchester, note also Norfolk and Lincolnshire, some of our most rural counties, but even so, adults very unlikely, unable to visit the natural environment. So a final, even more complex map, forgive me, this is the last data slide. This is early data, and the main thing to note from there, those little red blobs on the map show us some really quite shocking numbers. 2 out of 3 people don't have access to even half a hectare of green space close to home, within 200 metres of home. And 3/4 don't have access to what you might think of as a pretty generous garden or a pretty small park, 2 hectares. So some real rich data here that's showing us how little green space there actually is close to home. So just a few final thoughts then on why it all matters. So next slide, please. So if I didn't convince you there that for health and well-being reasons, we need green space, and we need green space everywhere, we need green infrastructure close to home. Just again, some figures and facts here on why it also matters for our resilience to climate change. making our cities not just better places to live in as climate change starts to impact us, the heating and cooling effects, but also that the green infrastructure itself is going to be part of our fight against climate change. And I think Minister Powell gave an example of cities that are reimagining themselves and putting green at the heart. Minister Powell gave an example. The example that I always comes to my mind is the work that's happening in Nottingham, looking at greening the Broadmarsh Retail Centre, with huge support from the public for that. And I think we are seeing the need we have for infrastructure, for retail infrastructure. This is a chance to reimagine our towns and cities. Next slide, please. So I think just finally a few things on what's happening then. So some notes here on what Natural England is doing to meet our vision of accessible green infrastructure, accessible green space for everybody. You'll hear more during the day about the green infrastructure standards and the design guide and so on. You've also heard Minister Powell already mention local nature recovery strategies, which will be mandated in the Environment Bill and will give us a brilliant decision-making framework about where and what type of green infrastructure we want. The Biodiversity Net Gain policy that Minister Powell also mentioned will help us fund green space. So within Natural England, we're putting all of that work very much in the same basket as we develop delivery and practice. We're also working on green social prescribing. Again, I've mentioned this already, this need to not only create green space, but to have our partnership work with Public Health England and NHS England is making sure that the people who most need that green space to cope with low-level physical and mental health problems also have link workers, have GPs, have people able to refer them to it and give them the confidence to use it. And the final note on there is about our Children and Nature programme, which is what it says on the tin, working with DFE, because children who have access to green space during the school day, the evidence shows us it improves their attendance at school, it improves their attentions in school, and therefore it improves their educational attainment. Next slide, please. So we know that it's needed. We also know that, as always, there is a challenge to fund these things. And again, I won't talk through this rather detailed slide, but the list there just shows you just how much there is, both public and private investment, and new policy funds emerging from government, like the Green Recovery Funds, like the new Environmental Land Management Scheme. I think the challenge we will have is this money isn't necessarily all coming on stream at once. And also we need to think very carefully about how we combine this public and private and third sector investment to maximise the benefits, thinking together about how in a space we make the best use of the money available. So my final slide then, about what next? I guess 3 key messages for me on here. The first thing is, now is the time to capitalise on the behaviour change we've seen through the COVID pandemic, that need to grab the opportunity and make the green space and get people using that green space fast. That does require those rather jargony words on the slide about systemic change, about government working together, about thinking about a whole range of regulations and policies and fundings to deliver it. We know there's appetite across government. We know this is something that matters to ministers, and we're being given a very clear signal by ministers. They want us to be working together. There's a job here for health, for education, for transport, for business, as well as for the conservation and environmental world, and for local government as well as national government. And I guess that's my final message, that quality of place word at the bottom of that slide. Now is the time to think. Now really is that social and economic tipping point we have to think about making the best quality green infrastructure we can in our towns and our cities, for our children and adults now, and for people like the little girl on the slide. Thank you.
Marion, thank you so much for that. There was an enormous amount of detail in there and some really exciting initiatives. I'm sure people will have a lot of questions. Don't forget to post your questions in the Q&A box, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen. You can also vote for other people's questions. So if somebody's asked a question which you also want to have answered, if you vote for it, that will push it up to the top of the list. So we'll be putting those questions to our speakers after they've all had a chance to speak. So I'm now delighted to welcome our next speaker, Joanna Averley. Joanna's Chief Planner at the Department of Communities and Local Government. Thank you. Welcome, Joanna, and over to you now.
Thanks, Julia. You missed out the H bit, which is the housing bit, but I know there's too many acronyms in our lives, aren't there? Thank you, everyone, and good morning. And I'm really delighted to be joining all of you and colleagues from across government to talk about a really important topic, which is how nature and green infrastructure actually supports our lives, our well-being, and actually I would suggest our economy. So what I thought I would do is just give you some observations about what we're doing in the department, the policy framework, I suppose, that's already live, and some of the tools that are already out there for local authorities, communities, and developers to be using to pursue many of the agendas that Minister Powell and Marion have just been talking about. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of aspects of the MPPF and then move on to the National Model Design Code, and then just give you a sort of little small personal reflection on where we were 30 years ago and where we are today, and some of the exciting opportunities that lie ahead of us in terms of how we plan for green infrastructure as an integrated part of our towns and cities. And I suppose at the heart of it, this is about town and country planning. This is about bringing nature into our urban areas, but also being clear about how our wider natural environment, how we're using that on the journey towards net zero and climate change and climate resilience. So first slide, please. Many on the call will know this, but just to give people an update, the National Planning Policy Framework sets basically the overarching policy for planning in England. And just after Christmas, we launched some revisions, and those revisions were reflecting on the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission work and other aspects of policy that were coming forward over the last sort of year or so. We've had a really strong set of responses from potentially people on this call, but many people around the MPPF, and we will be issuing the new version shortly, and that will now be in the planning system as the policy framework within which local authorities should be preparing plans and making development decisions. And obviously at the heart of it, next slide please, are the principles that actually sustainable development are the guiding principles, and is the guiding principle that should drive how we plan, as again how we make both development plans and actually how we make decisions. And it won't be any surprise to anybody in this call that that's about the economic, social objectives and environmental objectives. So I'm just going to bring that to life in the following slides, specifically on how that's translated into the National Design Guide. Thank you. Next slide. And the National Model Design Code. So the National Design Guide was launched about more than 18 months ago now, and that sets out sort of the key principles for development. And the National Model Design Code, alongside the MPPF in January, was also issued for a consultation response, and again will be issued formally, having got some input from colleagues from across the industry during that consultation window. So that again will be live very soon as something for everyone to use in the current planning system. Next slide, please. So the MPPF, again, we've very intentionally made sure that is about well-designed places, and has a chapter specifically dedicated to that. And then, as I say, sort of references the National Design Guide and the National Model Design Code. Next slide, please. This is probably the most important, if we can go on to slide 6, the most important, and I suppose the easiest reference slide that I'm going to present to you. This slide basically shows the content of the National Design Guide, and also how policy is formulated in the National Model Design Code. And as you will see, the role of nature and public space are very, very integrated into the national policy. This is a really important moment. It's about all of government using the planning system to deliver on our important agendas. And the National Model Design Code has been a kind of collective effort across Whitehall, and is the stronger document and a really meaningful document because of that. Next slide, please. So the National Design Guide, I think I would sort of see as sort of overarching principles about good placemaking, and very directly talks about green infrastructure. And if you go to slide 8, this then just presents those sorts of principles in summary. So there's a section on public space, there's a section on nature, and also on the next 2 slides, there's a section about resources, which actually is about not just the provision of green space, but also, you know, how we use materials, how we use resources, how we look at water, flood risk management, and all sorts of other things that are part of our sort of urban system and part of our natural system and part of how we think about development and the resource implications of development more broadly. Next slide, please. Importantly, this is not just about thinking about the green and the blue, but this is also about making sure that when we're looking at the design of the home, the space outside the home, both public and private, but then the wider environment for development, again, we're looking at all of these issues in the round. And so obviously it talks directly to aspects of the functional performance of a home. And you'll all be aware that the Future Home Standard has been issued, and there's lots of work going on relating to that in the department as well. But also that in terms of movement, and again, colleagues in DFT are doing lots of work about active travel, and this link between the journey from your door to the park or to your station or to your place of work or to the shops or to a cultural event, whatever it might be, that you have attractive and safe routes to use, which, you know, ideally would be tree lined, would be shaded for when they're on those hot summer days, you know, all those sort of aspects, so that moving around and the role and purpose of green space and green infrastructure within the environment actually makes moving around and your choices about active travel really obvious and the first choice. Next slide, please. So now just moving on to the National Model Design Code. As I sort of said, it's just going to be reissued following consultation. And let's just explain what that is as a document. I would describe it as a toolkit. It basically provides a sort of set of parameters, topics, and also some examples of how a local authority with the community or a developer could actually be sort of trying to think through the issues that are important to them, to specify expectations, and then to judge what's being brought forward by development against those expectations and those important issues. So it's designed as a really user-friendly document. Please, we'll post a link to it in the chat. It's can be used in the planning system now. Local authorities are encouraged to use the National Model Design Code as the basis for preparing design codes. And, you know, I just really encourage people to pick it up and use it now. And why it's important is because it's the way to sort of bring together all these issues into one set of policy considerations, so that we do deal with the green and the blue and the grey and the red infrastructure, so that our built and natural environment is being thought through comprehensively at one point. Next slide, please. And importantly, what the National Model Design Code outlines is a process. So it isn't a code in itself. What it is saying is, here's a process, here's a way to engage communities in the dialogue, to analyse what you've got in terms of urban and natural environments, to sort of set your sort of expectations and vision, and then how to then move that into sort of some degree of specification. Now, you can do that at the level of a local authority, you can do that at the level of an urban area, you can do it at the level of a site. And so the National Model Design Code can be picked up and used in all those different geographies. And I think really importantly, it starts from, as any good urban design principles or design principles start, it starts off with two important things. One is community input and understanding what's important to the people who live there now, and ideally reaching out to people who might be, you know, the future communities, you know, the people who want to buy a house in the local area and things like that. And secondly, a really strong understanding of place, an understanding of the assets, the opportunities, and sometimes the constraints that already exist in a place. So this diagram on the right is really important because it sort of shows you that journey, top right, from, you know, understanding mapping and information. And Marion's already talked about, you know, we're bringing forward more and more information that's in a usable format for local authorities and others to be able to understand what they've already got and what they're planning around. And then moving into principles of urban design, the structure of development, the structure of places, movement, massing, things like that, and then into specifying what you might want to specify about the home, and purpose and function of a home, beauty, its look and feel, how you then deal with those much more fine-grained issues, and specify expectation. Next slide, please. So what the code does is basically guide you through lots of different topics. if we think back to that slide with the sort of coloured boxes. And so here's just a few examples, just a few pages to draw out from the code. This is the page on nature, and the code comes in two parts, one which sort of sets, I suppose, principles, and then the part two, which actually then gives you sort of examples of some of the things that you might want to sort of draw into your local design code. And as you can see, very intentionally talks about green infrastructure, water and drainage, biodiversity, and so on, recognising, as has been already said by Minister Powell, the sort of the actual benefits, the health and well-being benefits, the obvious things around air quality, but all the wider aspects that nature and access to green and blue infrastructure actually gives us as human beings. So the ecological benefit, but also our own personal and human benefits that brings. Next slide, please. This is just another extract again, when you get down to that sort of finer grain level of specification, where you might be talking about green roofs or retention tanks or permeable surfacing or swales, how this then feeds through into a more fine-grained design expectation and functional expectation for both green and blue infrastructure. Next slide, please. Now, I just want to give you a little personal observation as to where we were 30 years ago and where we are now. So almost 30 years ago to the day, I'd started work as a planner, and the first project I ever worked on was mapping every public space in London. It was for the London Planning Advisory Committee, who were the client. This is pre-GLA, and we had paper-based survey returns from every local authority, every London borough, and every public space had a survey return. And I sat there with a computer, which would have been pre-WYSIWYG, so this would have been a black screen with green text, putting in ones and zeros, putting in all the survey entries for every single public space. And then, I don't know if anybody remembers, and with a planimeter, which was this strange thing which you used to measure the area on maps. Literally, you had the map, you had this planimeter, the area of every public space. The reason I sort of mention this, it's amusing to think how far we've come. But what I wanted to sort of recognise, which is we've had this kind of lineage of thinking about public space and its function for community, and in that work it was all about catchments and who fell inside or outside a catchment, and whether there was a under provision of public space, and the role of literally a local park, a region, right the way up to sort of regional and sort of city-based parks. Haven't we moved so far? We're now sort of talking about not just that from a sort of amenity point of view, but we're now looking at it from an ecology point of view, from a well-being point of view. It's just so much more broadly from an urban resilience point of view. And we're not just looking at the sort of formalised green space, but also the intermediate spaces, the role and purpose of the street, the role and purpose sometimes of a street corner, the role and purpose of ecology in our gardens and so on. And also, I just wanted to note, back to this point about technology, we're at this sort of really important point where bringing data, big data, into our planning systems, our ways of thinking. Again, Marion mentioned it, having that data available to us so we can really understand what we have as assets or where we've got constraints, and use that to sort of inform our planning. And that's a very big part of our thinking and the sort of innovations that we're working on at the moment within the planning directorate within MHCLG. And just a quick for example, might not seem related, but it just shows you some of the art of the possible and some of the sorts of things we're working on. We just launched two things called Ripper and Bops last week, where we're testing with some local authorities ways that you can use digital planning to sort of better engage in terms of application processes. So that's just one mini example, but the ability to use data and technology to make our decisions much more real and evidence-based, and actually really informed, and also really engaging. The information that's coming forward in terms of how digital engagement has changed over the course of the pandemic, with instead of hundreds of people but thousands of people engaging in a local plan or in a development project, is a really exciting opportunity for all of us. So that is part of this sort of journey that we're all on. It's not just the outcomes, but it's the process of engagement. It's the way we think through these issues and the way we then plan for really positive change. So just moving on to slide 16, the National Model Design Code talks then about the sort of how you would within new development design and talk about the function of public space. And in some work I've done prior to my role as Chief Planner, when looking at major schemes, particularly from a design review angle. For example, I was involved in the London Borough of Wandsworth's design review panel. One of the things we always did was start off with the role and purpose of public space in a scheme, to understand the street, to understand the front doors, to understand the role of public space, and also thinking about public space that operates through different generations, doorstep play all the way through to teenager play, and thinking about all of the different generations and their needs in terms of public access and public and play and interaction with nature. Next slide, please. And finally, just to rest on the really important emphasis we're placing on street trees, and again, greening our streets, not just because it makes them more attractive and actually sort of gives them amazing character, but because of these aspects to do with shading and urban resilience and impacting on cooling and heating. And I'll give you a little again domestic example. We're lucky to have a very tiny little garden, but it's quite shaded. Our neighbours, just having a chat at the weekend, they've got less shading and less grass, and they have a real serious issue with the heat coming in at the end of the day. It's not that our house doesn't heat up, but it doesn't heat up as much as next door, because we've got that little bit of shading and we've got a bit of grass, and that sort of just general cooling within that mini environment then obviously multiplies up at the level of the city as well, and the urban area. So lots in there. I really commend the National Model Design Code to you. The new version will be out shortly. It's there to be used now in the current system. Just to the last slide, please just pick it up, use it in your project, in your conversations as a community, in your conversations as an organisation. It's a really good starting point for the dialogue that we all need to have. Thank you.
Joanna, thank you so much. There's a lot in there, really interesting stuff, and we're getting lots of questions. So please continue to add your questions to the Q&A, and we'll put them to our speakers after our final speaker. So I'm very pleased to welcome now Professor John Newton. John is Director of Health Improvement at Public Health England. He's also Honorary Professor of Public Health and Epidemiology at the Universities of Manchester and Exeter, and is a Vice President of the UK Faculty of Public Health. So welcome, John, and over to you now.
Julia, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and I have to say I really enjoyed the previous talks, and I hope what I'm going to do is to build on that. So I'm going to, as Minister said at the beginning, the benefits of good quality green infrastructure are vast. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about the health benefits of good quality green infrastructure. But you'll see that my talk overlaps quite a bit with what we've already heard from Marion, and in fact from Joanna as well. So if I could have my first slide. My talk builds on a report that Public Health England produced last year, which was an update on a previous review of the health benefits of green space and green infrastructure. And it was led by the Public Health England Healthy Places team, but it was very much a collaboration with colleagues at the University of Exeter, colleagues in other government departments, including Defra, but also Natural England, I know, contributed a lot, and local authorities. So this whole area of work, actually, I think is a paradigm of collaboration, and it really benefits from that. And it runs through not just what we've done so far, but very much, I think, the future of this area of work relies on the quality of the collaborations, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And obviously the report's available for people to look at, and there'll be a lot more detail, but I'll just give you a flavour of the content with a few slides. So if I could have the next slide. This is perhaps one of the most important of all the slides. It shows that the benefits of green space are much broader than people sometimes think. So if we're looking at the top left-hand corner there, we know that people who spend time in green space adopt healthy behaviours more. So they take more physical activity, and they may also have a healthier lifestyle more generally as a result. But that's not the only benefit by any means. Some of the more profound benefits of access to green space are in the other segments. So we know on the top right-hand side that green space brings people together. It increases their social contacts. And this can really have tremendous benefits to people, gives them a sense of belonging in the sense of, in a place, and can reduce loneliness and other problems which are really very common and quite disabling for people. On the bottom left, we also know, particularly for younger people, but actually across the age spectrum, that spending time in green space can improve people's skills and capabilities. And there's good evidence that children who spend time in green space do better academically, and their behaviour can also change and be more productive in really, again, quite profound ways. And then finally, in the bottom right-hand corner, the point that Joanna just mentioned, that the presence of good quality green infrastructure has physical benefits for the environment, which have benefits for health. So addressing the problems of urban heat islands, reducing air pollution, and mitigating the impacts of floods. And these are all really quite significant benefits for health, as well as for other reasons. So if I could have the next slide. So a little bit more detail about what green space does for us in terms of physical health. I mean, the point to make here is that the evidence is continuing to build, and my colleagues in the University of Exeter are keeping the evidence under review. And what we now find is a breadth of evidence from multiple different methodological study designs, which all really reinforces the positive effect of green space on physical health. So here we have some examples. There are benefits for blood pressure, diabetes, and that can be measured. And there are biological measurements such as reduced level of stress hormones and differences in heart rate, which really support the conclusion that access to green space is good for our physical health, and that feeds through into measured lower levels of mortality. So if I could have the next slide. And of course, mental health it's also really striking that access to green space has these benefits for mental health. Now that's over the spectrum of mental health issues. So at one level, for a very large number of people, it simply improves our quality of life, and we just feel better when we have access to green space. But moving across the spectrum, it does reduce incidence of relatively minor mental health problems such as depression and anxiety and so on. But these are extremely common. So something which has a modest effect on these very common mental health problems adds up to a really substantial population benefit. And in particular, just at the bottom there, for children, access to green space can reduce rates of hyperactivity and inattention at school. So there are a wide range of mental health benefits. And again, the evidence is really robust to make that link. If I could have the next slide. So moving on a little bit more to some of the evidence that we found on the benefits of green space. And this will come up again, I think, in other talks. Green space is not a liability, it is an asset. And so the benefits are really substantial in financial terms. It's been estimated that if the whole country had access to good quality green space, and that's just England, there would be a saving of £2.1 billion per year in health costs. The return on investment is really quite staggering. It's a return of £34 for every £1 invested in maintaining good quality green space, which is not to say that it is, of course, difficult. You still have to find that £1 of investment, but the returns on that investment are really, really staggering. And there are very few other interventions in health that have that sort of level of return on investment. So the financial case for investing in green space for health benefits is really strong and quite profound. A few more slides on the detail of the benefits. So firstly, what's the size of the benefit? How much access to green space do you need to get a decent return? Well, this is a nice study which shows that using self-reported health, that access of a level of 2 to 3 hours a week in green space produces benefits which are similar to the other sorts of things that we would consider significant health health behaviour improvements, such as meeting the national guidelines for physical activity, or in fact the difference between the health of people who live in areas of high deprivation or low deprivation. So these are really quite significant benefits and significant changes in health, which are associated with spending 2 to 3 hours a week in green spaces. So if we could have the next slide, please. There's an important element of access to green space, which is related to addressing the impact of deprivation and inequality. And time and again, we see that access to green space is a protective factor in terms of health inequalities. And so the benefits of access are greater for people who live in more deprived communities. Now, this slide shows some data on mortality from cardiovascular disease in working age people. And the different graphs show the mortality in different levels of deprivation. So the blue are the most deprived relative to the least deprived. And the group 5 on the right are the people who have the best access to green space. And you can see there that the differences between the levels of deprivation in mortality from cardiovascular disease is substantially reduced. And so this is really exciting because there's a huge requirement. I mean, the health inequalities has been exposed again through the coronavirus pandemic, that health inequalities are very prevalent across the country and have been made significantly worse by coronavirus. So anything that we can do to address that is extremely welcome, and of course plays directly into the government's current priorities of recovery from COVID and levelling up. So again, this is a strong argument in favour of investing in green space for health benefit. If I could have the next slide, please. Now, the problem, of course, is that access to green space is itself unequal. And we know that people, I think it was illustrated, in fact, with Marion's, one of Marion's slides, that people who live in more affluent areas have better access to green space. And there are 2 slides here. One, the graph on the right shows the difference by deprivation. So people who are more affluent have better access to public parks and green space. And on the left, you've got access to private space gardens by different ethnic groups. And there are quite marked differences in people's access according to ethnicity or level of deprivation. So this compounds some of the other problems of health inequality, but is amenable to being addressed in our policies and planning. Next slide, please. So those slides have summarised really the areas of impact and the size of impact, and just a few examples of the nature of the problem. But it's I just wanted to highlight one of the current projects, which is the green social prescribing pilot, which is currently in the test and learn sites are piloting this. So this is a really good example again of cross-government working, where the funding from the Shared Outcomes Fund has been used to really try and drive the social prescribing for access to green space. And I think it was Marion who mentioned the fact that green space is an asset, but it does require work. It requires a service or some other effort to give people access to that asset, and that's where the social prescribing link workers and so on come in. And we will learn a lot about how to do that in this project, but also we will learn a lot about how the different agencies involved need to work together to achieve this shared outcome. So this is, I think, a really exciting development. So if I could have my next slide, please. So really just summing up on what I think these are the recommendations from our report, but really chime with, I think, the other talks that we already had this morning about what we need to do to maximise, for me, the health benefits of access to green space. I mean, the first thing is to promote the concept of green and blue spaces as assets, and to really try and promote them so that they are available in order to build them into our thinking about how to address both health issues directly, but also health inequalities. And this, of course, is very much in line with the work of a lot of other agencies who are thinking on the same lines. And I think there's real progress being made already in this respect. The second is to try and address all the various barriers to access which we know exist. And these are sometimes fairly obvious, they're just simple physical barriers, but are often less obvious. They're more to do with social and cultural issues and people's perceptions about whether these sorts of assets are for them. So trying to increase an individual's agency in this respect is important. And I know a lot of colleagues from local government will be very familiar with these sorts of issues and are doing a lot to address them. And the other thing we need to do in terms of promoting both just the assets themselves, but also removing barriers, is to prioritise deprived communities. There is very good evidence that they are the ones who will benefit most from anything we can do to improve access to green spaces. And again, with the coronavirus setting, this is all part of the recovery planning in local government, I'm sure, to start by addressing the needs of the most deprived first. I think there's a very strong conclusion, which is that this sort of work requires cross-agency work. Even at local level, there are many different agencies need to be involved, and even different departments within local government need to work very closely together. And certainly we need a lot of cross-government working if we are to provide the national support that's needed for this work. But again, I think really good examples of that already. And then finally, it does require resilient funding. And this is a challenge. As I said, the return on investment is enormous for investing in good quality green infrastructure. But nevertheless, we do need to find that initial seed money to develop these assets. So that does remain a challenge both locally and nationally. But as I think a number of speakers have said, there's no doubt that there's a huge opportunity as we come out of the coronavirus pandemic to grasp this opportunity to build back fairer, build back greener. We have a very strong evidence base, which I hope we've summarised and made available to you so that you can use it in your work. And there are lots of good examples to build on. So I think we should feel very optimistic for the role that green infrastructure can play as we come out of COVID. And the work on the green infrastructure standards will be absolutely key to that. And some of the assets produced will be really helpful indeed. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. That was a really, really powerful presentation. The amount of evidence of the benefits of green infrastructure to our health has grown so much over the last few years, and it's great to have it all rounded up into one document by Public Health England, and to hear how much support the public health sector has for green spaces. Those were all of our formal presentations, and it's now time for our questions and answers. So if our speakers would like to switch on their cameras and mics, that would be great. Now, before we get going into the questions, we do have a poll. So I think that should appear as if by magic. Great to see you, Rachel. So if you click on the poll button on the right-hand side of your screen, there should be a poll that you can answer. So audience, if you'd like to have a go at that right now while I round up the speakers. So that should be happening at the moment. So thank you all for your presentations. I'd like to introduce Rachel Fisher. Minister Powell is unable to be with us today for the question and answer session. So Rachel has very kindly agreed to attend on behalf of Defra. Rachel's Deputy Director for Land Use Policy at Defra. She began this role in September 2020 and is responsible for developing and delivering environmental planning reform policy, local nature recovery strategies, and biodiversity net gain. So welcome, Rachel. And I think we've got Marion slightly cut off at the bottom of my screen, but I think she's there as well. So we've had lots and lots of questions. Before we get into some of them, I'm going to be naughty as the chair and put my own question to you. A few years ago, there was a public parks inquiry by the MHCLG Select Committee, and one of its findings was that government was really disjointed and that policy for green infrastructure was split between Defra and the MHCLG, but also affected DCMS, etc., etc. It's fantastic to have with us today representatives from Public Health England, an agency of the Health Department, from Defra, from Natural England, and from MHCLG. So the impression I'm getting is that things are a bit more joined up within government. Is that really happening? And is it going to get even better? Could we one day perhaps see the Treasury joining in? Where's it all heading?
I'm happy to go first, Julia, if colleagues then want to sort of, from their perspective, give their view. What I find really striking about preparation of National Model Design Code is because planning is the route, you know, in doing planning, you have to think about so many different aspects of the built and natural environment and the process by which they change. In preparing the National Model Design Code, we reached out pretty much to every government department, as we are in so many policy areas within the planning sphere, and obviously working really closely with Rachel and colleagues on biodiversity net gain and local nature recovery strategies. So we're at this sort of moment where we are managing to bring things together, and the National Model Design Code, I think, is just one example of where that's happening in real time. So yes, you can imagine the sort of the conversations, because we've got aspects to do with transport and conversations to DFT about updating the manual for streets, aspects to do with biodiversity net gain and bringing nature into our thinking about new development. I mean, it touches so many things. So yeah, no, being newish into Whitehall in a civil servant role, I'm seeing lots of kind of connections and lots of common agendas on policy at the moment. And it's climate change forces that conversation even more. It's an exciting moment, I think.
Great, yeah, Joanna. Rachel, would you like to add something?
Sure, and I mean, just to obviously completely agree with Joanna. I think it's great that we have all of us here together now. I think of green infrastructure as sort of the green thread that brings all of these different things together. It knits together so many of the agendas that we're all working on across Whitehall, but also through out into local government, as John was talking about. And it's really, really important that we think about green infrastructure as a kind of pivot point for a lot of the different agendas, because it can deliver on so many things. And it's also something that everybody has direct personal experience of. So everybody has a local park that they can talk about. Everybody has something that, you know, that green infrastructure touches their lives in some way. And that's a really helpful thing as well, in terms of bringing people together to really understand the multiple benefits that you can get. So I think I agree with Joanna. It's good that we're already doing quite a lot of work together, and there's scope, I think, still to go even further.
Yeah.
And Julia, may I add? So absolutely agree, and really please, not at this conference, but round the table with us, we have Transport, who of course are major owners of land and a major influence of land space. I'm kind of hoping we might get other big government departments that own land, like the MOD, round the table as well. The bit that's missing for me at the moment is the role of business, not necessarily business as a department, but I think for me, one of the things I'd like to try and get out of events like this is to help employers really understand the benefits of green space to their employees, and perhaps make it part of their health and safety officer, their occupational offer, because of that sense of then, you know, if people are weller because of green space, healthier and happier, less lost time at work. So I think that's the missing link for me. The other question, perhaps I'll throw it back as an open question. I think the other challenge is local government as joined up as it needs to be? Are the transport bits of local government talking to the social care bits of local government, talking to the climate change bits of local government? So I think there's also something for us all to be vigilant and challenging ourselves at a local level as well.
Yeah. Julia, could I just, I agree with Marion. I think there are lots of good examples around green spaces of cross-government working. I mean, we contributed to the 25-year environment plan, and there's the social prescribing work, and there's actually a new cross-government committee on prevention for health, which has been announced, and that is the sort of thing which could help again to drive cross-government work. But it still feels a little bit as if we're just meeting at the edges rather than it being mainstream, everyone working together. So I think there is still there is still work to do. And as Marion says, it's not just about government.
I think that that's a really interesting point, that it's happening, but perhaps it's a little bit feels a little bit contingent at the moment. It would be great if it becomes mainstream, and it's great that it's heading in that direction. So thank you for those comments. I'm now going to move on to some of the questions from the audience. Now, one of them is about the new green infrastructure standards. I'm really saying, will these standards have bite? Will the policy say this must be done, or will it be it could be done or it might be done? Because I think we all know that unless policy is absolutely firm, developers and others who might want to just cut corners or do things a bit quickly might try and wriggle out of things, particularly in areas where land values are lower. So can any of you say anything about this? I don't know, Joanna, whether you can say.
Yeah, let me come in on the role and purpose of coding, and then Rachel might want to come in on you know, or Marian on 20% biodiversity net gain, which is a number. It's not a, or you can kind of maybe do something like this. So on national design, on the national design code, the principle is that local authorities can now start to prepare codes, and within that specify what they see as important and what they will judge development against. Equally, the Mppf gives hooks for local authorities to consider these things. Now, we all know that planning often ends up having to be the space where you navigate, you negotiate, you know, different competing aspirations, you know, the number of homes, the quality of the public realm, you know, the provision of wider social infrastructure and things like that. But the point I think that we're at is really important, which is that all of these considerations are there on the table at the start. Local authorities can use design codes as a way of being really clear about their expectation, and then to an extent holding developers to account. So it's no longer a kind of specialist subject, I suppose. It's sort of very much more mainstream within planning. So I think that's a really important point. Now, Rachel may want to say a little bit more about biodiversity net gain, because that's an even firmer hook, I think.
Thanks for the setup, Joanna. So biodiversity net gain is a requirement for 10% uplift in biodiversity and habitat creation off the back of new development. And we've recently acquired that through the Environment Bill for all things being granted TCPA planning permission as opposed to NSIP planning permission. We're now looking at how you can implement biodiversity net gain for major infrastructure as well. So this is a really big hook for how do you leave a development site better than the situation in which you found it. And I think what we're trying to do is link through, as the kind of like green thread that I keep talking about, link through biodiversity net gain at a sort of site specific level, and also thinking about how you make offsite contributions through to up to local nature recovery strategies at that kind of more strategic spatial scale. And I think the green infrastructure standards are the kind of glue in my head. And hopefully in others' heads as well, that starts to give you the standards for the quality and kind of location and all of those kinds of things that you need to think through. So the standards themselves dock in at a couple of points within the planning process, but also through biodiversity net gain and also local nature recovery strategies. So I think we're trying to bite this apple from a number of different directions, if I can mix a really terrible metaphor. And we're trying to do this in a number of different ways, which I think is what will help in terms of having kind of overall leverage when you're actually getting to the end product.
And Julia, I agree with absolutely everything that Rachel and John have said, that mandation is not always the answer. Somehow it is about how different drivers and things put together. I think probably the most interesting bit for me is how developers are going to react to this. I'm not sure how many developers we've got on the call today. Certainly some of the developers we are working with are way ahead of the game, and even before the biodiversity net gain and infrastructure standards are mandated, are recognising a market advantage here. So I think that's the other thing for us, again, to all be alert to be keeping alive to. How can we get some consumer pressure for people who buy houses, but also some community pressure to really put that pressure on decision makers, as well as using mandated standards?
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to move on to another question, which is that it's about funding, which is always a big question when it comes to green infrastructure and particularly local parks. During the last year, people have really increased their use of local parks, which has been wonderful in many respects. But for park managers, it's been an absolute nightmare because the amount of wear and tear and huge quantities of litter have added to the costs of managing parks. And yet their budgets are static and in many places shrinking. Marion, in your presentation, you set out an awful lot of funding opportunities, which is really exciting. But a lot of those seem to be capital funding for creating or doing big, brand new parks. But what about that boring but really important day-to-day stuff about making sure that the Parks Department has enough money to maintain things? Are there any signs of change there? Because at the moment, I don't think they're being felt on the ground, but they might be happening higher up in policy. I'm not sure.
I spotted that question in the chat, Julie, about, you know, not about managing them, but also that bit that both John and I touched on about the importance of having people to engage people in using green space. I absolutely recognise that challenge, that capital to build is not the answer. There is not an easy answer, if I am very honest, and I might invite Rachel and Joanna. I'm not sure this has yet been started to think about where public funding comes from. There's a lot of funding coming from places like the Heritage Lottery Fund. There's funding coming from some of the sort of philanthropic side of it. But I think it might be a gap in the government armoury that we need to think about. It partly goes back to that point I was making earlier again, that hopefully as we are starting to see the evidence that John presented very powerfully about the benefits this brings to people, that it might be something that also becomes higher up spending decisions for local government as well as national government. But I think we need to keep making the case and making the evidence. I would also say rather cheekily, I absolutely feel the pain of those who manage parks and some of the difficulties. We had them on our own nature reserves. Many of our NGO colleagues had quite a lot of difficulty, but I can't stop myself from rather cheekily. It's quite a nice problem to have. I'd rather have that problem than have the problem of nobody wanting to use green space. I think people are starting to realise this is a nice thing to do. It's not just good for them, it's an enjoyable thing to do, but there is work to do for all of us in both the resources to manage sites and also the messaging through things like the Countryside Code.
Thank you. Yeah. John, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I mean, I think it is possibly the most important problem at the moment, isn't it? I mean, I think the evidence base is building. There are lots of people with lots of good ideas. We've got these standards coming along. Somebody needs to find the money from somewhere, and it's not just a question of advocacy. It's not a question of us all just sort of shouting more loudly. Somebody's got to come up with a way of managing the economics such that the the external benefits are fed back. And I'm thinking of the sort of work that social finance did. I don't know whether people are familiar with social finance, but they had very clever ways of managing to create ways of turning capital into revenue for things which are beneficial. So I'm sure there are solutions if we get clever enough people thinking about this with access to policymakers, because it is a highly efficient thing to do with public money and with private money. So I just think we just need to get the right policy boffins working on this.
Great, and I hope that fantastic evidence you've got about the spending £1 bringing £34 of health benefits is really promoted widely, because you'd very much hope that the Treasury, who keep asking about productivity and how we can improve productivity, surely if we could help people's health improve, that might be one of the answers to improving productivity. I think for those of us in the sector, it seems like a no-brainer, but we haven't got there yet in persuading others to make that funding commitment. We've had a question as well about people paving over their front gardens, and this is a perennial bugbear of many people. People's front gardens are private. I assume that planning policy doesn't really affect them very much, but we know that cumulatively in a city, the impact of lots and lots and lots of homes having paved over front gardens has quite a big effect. And Joanna, you spoke very powerfully of the difference in temperature of a small shady garden compared with one that wasn't shady. Do any of you have any thoughts about what powers there might be to prevent this, or is it down to persuading people that it's a bad idea?
I think it has been an issue for a long time. I mean, again, back in the 90s, the first studies about residential environmental quality recognised that, the sort of breaking up of the street is detrimental not just to the aesthetic, but actually to the function of the street, the purpose of the pavement, which is for people to walk on, not for cars to cross. All these sorts of things. It often sort of front garden parking has sort of ramifications for how people, the sort of choices that people then make if they're moving around their part of their town or city. There are various things that sort of play out in this, which is if your front garden is not big enough to hold a car, you will keep your front pavement. It's a very practical point. And often what you'll find in many of our kind of urban environments, sort of certainly the Edwardian houses, is the frontage of the house is often exactly the right size for a sort of a parking space on the road, not in the front garden. So there is a sort of mindset issue, but I'm going to invite another problem, which is we also have to deal with electric vehicle charge points as well, and so we need to be careful that doesn't drive unwanted decisions about, again, sort of the needing to sort of plug into your house to charge your car. And so I think thinking all the purpose and function of the street as a whole and all those different user needs is actually really important, and that we do that really proactively. So I think it's an active and live discussion, Julia, which I think we need to sort of be returning to. And without sort of overemphasizing design codes when it comes to the design and development of new homes, and that is the sort of thing that should be actively addressed rather than left as an afterthought. And also in terms of our existing streets, then neighbourhood planning and other documentation can sort of start to sort of say these are the aspects of our environments that are important to us and we want to maintain, and we want to sort of to some extent safeguard the character of our streets and our built environment and how they're used, the flexibility with which they're used, but that we don't do things that are detrimental to sort of the people who use those streets and those pavements.
Great, thank you. Marion, I can't actually see you on the screen, so I can't tell whether you'd like to say anything. I don't know if you'd like to add to that, or should I move on to another question?
I wasn't signaling, Julia, but I suppose the other thought that it's Joanna's point about design and detail, isn't it? And thinking about the wider strategic issues. I also, again, I found myself thinking that there are ways of creating parking spaces that are not entirely ungreen. There are these sort of parking mats. You can still have a tree near to it. So maybe there's also something about getting the gardening magazines involved, getting, that sort of not necessarily horticultural trade association, but people that think about garden design to think, I'm lucky I live in a rural area and I have parking. When I lived in London, my biggest nightmare on a Friday evening was would I actually be able to park? So I absolutely understand why people want to break over their gardens, but there are ways of keeping them green and thinking about sustainable drainage solutions as well, because as well as problems with green space, paved over gardens, of course, also contribute to flash flooding and so on in urban areas. So perhaps there's a private sector, an innovative design company that would like to think about a green parking space and a green charging point.
Thank you. We've had several questions which refer to the lack of capacity within councils to deliver some of this policy. So one of them, for instance, says we have good green infrastructure policy in our local plan, but lack the staff to ensure its successful implementation. And a similar question around biodiversity net gain. So we know that councils' budgets have been under pressure and that they've lost a lot of staff. You're bringing forward some really interesting policy. Is it actually going to be delivered? Are there any plans to boost the qualified staff in councils who could help do this? I don't know if any of you are willing. Rachel.
Yeah, happy to come in. So we're doing some work with the Planning Advisory Service and others at the minute to look at the capacity, particularly for the delivery of biodiversity net gain within local authorities. And we're also looking at how we can provide funding to support local authorities in implementing biodiversity net gain specifically. But I suspect that there will be knock-on benefits of having additional ecologists and others working in local government for the delivery of the rest of these policies as well. So it's something that we're very aware of, and something obviously that when we speak to our colleagues at MHCLG, both in kind of local government policy but also planning policy, this is not a huge surprise, and it is something that we're aware of, and we're thinking about how we can help support local authorities to deliver all of this, because we're conscious that these are new things in some places that need some support, and at the very least require guidance and that kind of support as well.
And just to add to that, we launched 14 pilot programs with design coding with 14 local authorities across England earlier on, and we're sort of halfway through that piloting program, and that's provided a real opportunity to get real-time feedback from local authorities and how they're using the code, how they're doing the consultation process that they're putting around it, the issues that are particular to them. And what's brilliant about it is we've got everything from a county looking at coding, say Herefordshire, right the way through to, you know, an urban, you know, site-based, smaller regeneration-based code on the Ousburn in Newcastle. So we've got, you know, we've got that kind of full range of projects, and we'll be launching and extending some of that piloting work sort of over the summer. So watch this space. If there's local authorities interested and listening into this conversation, then you know, keep an eye out for that, because we'll go forward into another sort of bit of piloting. Now, we're not doing piloting just for the sake of those local authorities. They obviously provide a lot of learning, so we can then sort of disseminate sort of best practice and information and a bit more sort of the sort of how-to elements of design coding and put that out there for others to benefit from. And also, you know, the National Model Design Code has been really well received, and there's many organisations starting to do learning programmes as well. So just, there are many providers, but Design London are running something called Code School at the moment. So there's lots of take-up, sort of easy access sort of information about how to use coding for your place and in real time. So we're very live to that issue about, you know, change brings different opportunities, but it also brings different demands on local government, and we're thinking proactively about that as we sort of roll out design coding. And then finally, just to mention, Julia, there's obviously we're doing work on the as part of the sort of interim office for place around, again, design coding not just being a piece of policy that drops into the pond, but actually how we support local government and communities in taking up design coding and use it as a very proactive tool. So lots going on in this space, which will continue to emerge over the coming months.
Great, thank you. And you've just mentioned the Office for Place, Joanna, which is being set up. Do you have any idea when it's going to be launched, and will it be thinking about green infrastructure?
So the interim office for place and its work will actually hang off the National Model Design Code. So yes, all of these issues are very much in its DNA actually, and there'll be announcements in the forthcoming sort of weeks and months about its role and function and purpose. So watch this space.
Thank you. We've got, as I mentioned earlier, representatives from all various different bits of government on the panel today. We haven't got anyone from education, and somebody has put in the questions that the national curriculum includes very little requirement for children to access the outdoors and local green spaces, including their own school grounds, which is an interesting point. And I just wondered, Professor Newton, if I could put you on the spot slightly, because in your slides you showed some very powerful evidence about how being in green spaces can improve children's development and reduce attention I can't think what it's called now.
Hyperactivity.
Thank you. You were also talking about a cross-government department to think about prevention, in other words, preventing illness. Do you think there's more that could be done around education and green spaces? And is Public Health England in a situation to be able to put that evidence in front of people in the Department of Education?
Well, I certainly do agree. It's a huge potential opportunity, and certainly there's a lesson that we had in developing policy on obesity was that it was easier to start to get government support to address child obesity than it was to address adult obesity. So I think there's a strong argument actually for saying, let's see if we can get this right for children. There's also, I thought someone else has said, is there a green infrastructure for schools fund? That's a great idea, isn't it? I mean, why not? I mean, why, you know, what sort of society doesn't want to invest in green infrastructure for children, you know, during their school day? I mean, it's a great opportunity to take people who would otherwise live in really poorly served communities and expose them for quite substantial periods of their day to good quality green infrastructure. It could have a huge benefit. I imagine that return on investment for investing in green infrastructure for schools would be just colossal. So I think that would be a sweet spot. And so in terms of what can Public Health England do? Public Health England can't do a lot because we're being abolished. Actually, we're coming to an end later this year. But there is an exciting proposal there is the Office for Health Promotion, which will be set up within the Department of Health, which I think will be very well placed to take this forward. And within that, there will be a strong directorate looking particularly at the needs of children. So I think there will be a great opportunity to work with the new Office for Place around these sorts of issues. And this cross-government committee, which is still, we haven't heard a great deal about it. It's still, the policy will be described later, but clearly this is exactly the sort of issue that committee is designed to address. The coronavirus pandemic has landed the message that health is a whole of government issue. And so there are, I think, a number of opportunities to take this forward in these new structures.
Thank you very much. And the TCPA has done a lot of work around 20-minute neighbourhoods and greening places. Both Paris and Amsterdam are investing heavily in their school playgrounds and opening them up to the wider public and making them greener and turning them into fantastic community assets. So there's an awful lot I think we can learn from other places in regard to that as well.
Yeah, and just to come in, Julia, on that, I mean, the dual use of space is a really interesting objective, isn't it? And our public buildings and our public spaces that are behind the gate line, particularly in school environments, and making them more accessible. So there's some interesting precedent going on about that. And the other thing I just wanted to offer, which was a couple of years ago, there was this sort of push on a mile a day, which so many kids, just speaking from personal experience, my kids' primary school did it, and they all went out every day and ran around. They're lucky they sort of right beside a little recreation ground and ran around that. And it was a very simple thing to do. The concept was so straightforward and easy to sort of grasp and then just implement, which was just go for a run, en masse. So there are sort of things like that which are about sort of, open access to spaces and how we, use school premises in kind of creative ways. But bearing in mind, there are ramifications for schools, so they can then make sure that the space is then, in effect, safe for when the children are then occupying the space the next day. But then these sort of the campaigns around health and well-being in schools, it's just such an interesting agenda, isn't it? How you link that to public space.
Thanks, Joanna. And yes, there are implications for schools maintaining those spaces and making sure that they're fit for the children when they return on a Monday morning. But I do feel if it can be worked out in Paris, and if they can make it work in Amsterdam, we can surely make it work here as well, because the health benefits and community benefits would be so huge. We've just got a very tiny bit of time left. I'm going to just ask one more question. Joanna, I'm going to ask it to you. I think it's about green roofs. So somebody's saying green blue roofs are an easy way of adding environmental benefit to developments, and yet I always have to ask for them to be added. Can't there be stronger incentives to include them? Quick reply on that one, if you would.
Put it in a code, and then there'll be no doubt that that's something that you're looking to achieve as a local planning authority. Great,
really easy one. So put it in your design code, and that should solve the problem. Wonderful. I'm going to be drawing this to a close. The next session will start at 11:30, so there's a half-hour break for everybody. And the focus of the next session is going to be around biodiversity net gain. So there have been some questions in the question box about that, but I think probably put those questions to the biodiversity net gain experts at the next session, and they should be able to provide you with some answers. So I do hope you can join us then. The final session will start at 2 p.m. and run till 2:30. And just to remind you, if you can't tune in to all of the sessions live, they will be posted on the TCPA's website in the next few days, and you will be able to download them then. So I'd just like to thank all of our speakers. We've had some fantastic presentations. There's so much going on at the moment, and amazingly, it seems to be quite joined up, which is really encouraging to hear. I think the next step might be to get away from running lots of pilots and make this all absolutely mainstream. Without a doubt, green infrastructure has to be done, no questions, let's do it really well. So we'll look forward to the other sessions, which will go into more depth about what Biodiversity Net Gain is going to provide, and the final session will look at the green infrastructure standards. So I do hope you can join us at the next session. Thank you very much to our speakers, and see you all in half an hour.